Hello, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for joining our live webinar on higher apprenticeships and higher vet. My name is Letizia, and I am a member of the Apprenticeship Support Services team at Ecoris. I will be your moderator today. To all our participants watching, please feel free to leave comments or ask questions to specific speakers in the chat below during the webinar, and Sarah and I, my colleague, will raise these in our Q&A session at the end. So now I would like to introduce you to today's speakers. Tim Schreiber, a policy officer at the European Commission's Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, who will introduce the topic of higher vet and its relevance and will present the relevant challenges and trends. Jörg Markovic, a senior partner at 3S Research and Consultancy, who will provide an overview of higher apprenticeships in Europe. And finally, Stéphanie Devez, the Deputy Head of the Unit of Education and Employment Relationships with the French Ministry of Higher Education, Research and Innovation, who will present the French case study example. And without any further delay, I give the floor to Tim, who will introduce you to the topic of our webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Letty, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all on behalf of the European Commission to today's webinar, which is looking at a very relevant topic. We've seen over the last decades that vocational education and training, which of course includes apprenticeships, has expanded and opened up in many different ways. And very concretely, we see that many different programs have emerged at what we call level 5 and above of the European qualifications framework. So these programs are usually referred to as higher vet. There are also some people and some work strands that refer to them as professional tertiary education. We will learn more about these definition questions in a bit. But what all these programs have in common is that they really focus on very applied knowledge. And from a policymaker perspective, what is also very important is that these programs, in some cases at least, are the only type of tertiary education that is directly accessible for vet learners. So what they do is that they actually provide a bridge from vet into what we call academic higher education, and thereby also facilitating the permeability between different sectors of education and training. In the end, higher vet therefore helps also to increase the image and the attractivity of vet as a career path, because it provides these pathways from one sector to another. We see that vet at higher levels, higher vet, also opens doors to learners who otherwise would maybe not have entered tertiary education. For example, those who are the first in their family to pursue tertiary education, or learners from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people with migrant background, etc. At the same time, these programs also play a key role in up and reskilling adults, those adults who can build on previous studies, on non-formally acquired knowledge and competencies, because we really need more people participating in lifelong learning. We see that there are still not enough people who continue learning once they finished with initial education and training. And if we look at the speed of the digital and the green transitions and how they significantly change the labor markets, we really have to have everybody on board and continue learning throughout the career. At EU level, we have one of the main policy documents, which is called the Council Recommendation on VET, which we adopted in 2020. And there we call on member states very explicitly to further develop higher VET programs at the highest levels of the European qualifications framework. So levels 5 up to 8, including PhD level. And we'll also hear about higher apprenticeships at PhD level today, which I find particularly interesting. As European Commission, we also have co-financed a recent OECD study on the topic called Pathways to Professions that was published actually last week. And with this study, we aim also to improve our understanding, our empirical knowledge of this very diverse field of higher vocational and professional tertiary education. And without much further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Jörg, saying that I'm very much looking forward to learning about a very specific topic, namely higher apprenticeships, which are part of higher vet, but still present a very particular case. And I'm looking very much forward to learning more about it and to continue the discussion later. Thank you, and Jörg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim, and a warm hello from Vienna. I will try to give you a brief overview of higher apprenticeships in Europe and also ask you to help me complete this overview. And if there's time left, I would share with you an example from the German context before Stephanie will present the French approach to higher apprenticeships in much more detail. Now, when talking about the development of higher apprenticeships, it is important to understand that in Europe, vocational education and training in general, and apprenticeships in particular, have expanded in various ways since at least the 1990s, I would say. Firstly, apprenticeships have opened up to new target groups, in particular to adult learners. For instance, shorter apprenticeship programs have been introduced in Switzerland and Austria to particularly address the needs of adult learners. But also longer programs and partial qualifications have been established to offer new opportunities to learners with special needs. Furthermore, access to apprenticeship programs for refugees and asylum seekers have been made possible in various countries during and after the refugee crisis of 2015-2016. Secondly, young men have traditionally been the beneficiaries of apprenticeships, you can say, for example, in manufacturing and the crafts. However, more and more apprenticeships have been launched in the service sector, which has now led to an increase in female participation. For instance, the integration of the health and care training into the Swiss apprenticeship system some years ago has led to a much more balanced gender ratio, at least in the overall figures. Thirdly, I'd like to mention that in the 1990s, new hybrid forms emerged to provide apprenticeship graduates with an access to higher education, such as the so-called Berufsmaturität in Switzerland, the Baccalaureat Professionnel or Bac Pro in France, and the Berufsreifeprüfung, known also as Berufsmatura or Vocational Matura in Austria, to give just a few examples. Finally, the most remarkable trend over the last 2 decades is the one towards higher and more theoretical VET programs. A trend which seems to be universal, as we have been able to observe it across all member states in school-based VET as well as in apprenticeship systems. So in short, what we see is that the heartland of VET has moved from level 3 to level 4 and beyond within the EAfA, the European Qualifications Framework. Besides these changes within vocational education and training per se, it is important to note that at the same time, an extensive vocational drift within higher education has taken place, which I think is most evident in the rising student numbers at universities of applied sciences. And it is within this context, higher apprenticeship needs to be seen. Now, what do we mean by higher apprenticeship and how does it differ from higher VET? Well, first of all, when we refer to higher VET, we refer to programs, as explained by Tim, which lead to qualifications at EAfA level 5 and higher. Secondly, we can distinguish between programs which are considered part of the European higher education area and such which are outside the area, but are still part of the EAfA, as you can see in the figure. Now, that way, you can distinguish between a narrow definition of higher VET and a broader definition. So the narrow definition is vocationally oriented programs which lead to an EAfA level 5 or higher and are not part of the higher education area. So they are outside of higher education. However, due to the vocational drift observed over the last decades, I mentioned earlier, we meanwhile actually need to distinguish in the higher education area also a distinctive professional higher education sector. So in essence, we need to acknowledge that most member states, not all, but most, have a so-called binary higher education system with traditional research and academically oriented universities on the one hand, and more professionally and practice-oriented universities of applied sciences, polytechnics, and further education colleges on the other hand. Now, a broader definition now of higher ed encompasses also this sector of professional higher education. So we could speak of higher vocational and professional education and training in a broader sense. And when we talk about higher apprenticeship, it's also a blurry concept because that sits somehow in between these two sectors, either part of the narrow definition or the broader definition. In fact, countries differ a lot as regards the conception of higher ed and higher apprenticeship. Some follow the narrow definition, others follow the broader definition. That's partly also the reason why we actually have no reliable international statistics to monitor the development of higher apprenticeships. And also we have no statistics to monitor the extent of vocational drift within higher education. While ISCED, the International Standard Classification of Education, distinguishes between general and vocational programs at the secondary level, it does not yet distinguish between academic and professional programs at the tertiary level. A problem which has recently taken up by the OECD report mentioned earlier by Tim, by the way. Now, despite these different definitions, higher apprenticeship share some common features across countries. Next slide, please. So learners achieve a qualification at EAfA level 5 and above, as just said, benefit from combining academic with vocational content, as mentioned by Tim, through alternate training in classroom and enterprises, and are being paid while studying. So these are the common features similar to all apprenticeships, also at higher level. I think the distinctive characteristic of higher apprenticeship is actually their hybrid character. And this hybrid character happens at several levels. It's hybrid in terms of vocational and general education, but it's also a hybrid in terms of getting a skilled worker training and an academic education. And it's also a hybrid of a vocational qualification and a higher education degree, or sometimes a double qualification. Now let me move on to the overview on higher apprenticeship schemes which are currently offered in Europe. In Germany, so-called dual study programs exist already since the 1970s and are offered in a variety of formats. Previously mainly provided by so-called Berufsakademien, or universities of cooperative education, as they are called in English. Meanwhile, Fachhochschulen, or universities of applied sciences, are the main providers. These programs are actually not considered an apprenticeship, or most of them, but rather a very practice-oriented higher education program with paid long-term internships in an enterprise, which usually leads to a bachelor or master degree. There are roughly 100,000 students enrolled in dual study programs in Germany, mostly in the area of business and engineering. And I'll give you an example later if there is time. Now, equally in France, there are different forms of higher apprenticeship, and Stephanie will tell you more about it. So I go on to Italy, where we find the so-called Higher Education and Research Apprenticeship Program, which was introduced in 2011. And in this program, young people aged 18 to 29 can acquire a bachelor or master degree while working. The duration of the company-based company part, so to say, of the apprenticeship must be at least half a year. However, this scheme is the Cinderella of the three types of apprenticeships in Italy, with the lowest number of participants. And according to latest data, we found only around 1,000 apprentices are currently enrolled in this type of program. Now, in England, a higher apprenticeship can take 1 to 5 years to complete and involves part-time study at a college, university, or training provider. Higher apprenticeships are considered apprenticeships at National Vocational Qualification 4 or above, with most apprentices gaining actually an NVQ level 4 higher national diploma or foundation degree. So these are all EAfA level 5 qualifications. Higher apprenticeships in England account for nearly a third of all apprenticeship starts in the last academic year. That means around 60,000 starts, an increase of 27% in the number of higher apprenticeships starts compared to the previous year. So quite an increase. Now, also in Scotland, there are high apprenticeships called graduate apprenticeships. They exist in addition to the so-called modern apprenticeships, which is the most common type of apprenticeship, and foundation apprenticeship, which I consider a sort of pre-apprenticeship program. Now, these graduate apprenticeships in Scotland were introduced in 2014 and lead to the acquisition of qualifications equivalent to EAfA level 6 and 7. And in the academic year 2018-19, where I found statistics, there was an average of 2,500 learners in Scotland. Now, also in the French-speaking part of Belgium, an apprenticeship called master degree or dual master was created recently, specifically for encouraging cooperation at local level between university, colleges, and enterprises. And students spend 50% of the time at school and 50% at the enterprise. Now, this dual master in Belgium is an integral part of the higher education system in Belgium and thus falls under the broader definition of higher ed, if you like. I forgot to mention Ireland. There we found at the University of Limerick a professional doctorate in engineering. Now, the so-called principal engineer apprenticeship is a 4-year blended doctorate program, and the research is directly related to activities in the company. The participation in that program is to 90% funded by SOLAS, which is the state agency for further education and training in Ireland. Finally, in Malta, we found that the Work-Based Learning and Apprenticeship Act allows for apprenticeships at higher levels, but unfortunately, we haven't found any information about actual programs. So maybe there is someone listening from Malta who can shed some light on this possibility in Malta. So from these examples, you can see that Germany and France are probably, and the UK are probably the forerunners in that area, although they follow quite different approaches. But you can also see that offering higher apprenticeships is not a matter of size of the country. Rather, it is an issue how much diversification and flexibility is possible, both within the higher education sector and the apprenticeship system. So, well, after these short overview on programs we could identify so far for Europe, I would like to invite you via the chat function to tell us about your own experience with higher apprenticeships in your country. Please feel free to correct any information I gave on your country, but even more, we are interested to hear from countries I have not mentioned, whether there are any higher apprenticeships programs offered. So please tell us by using the chat function, and with your help, we would like to complete this overview. And I hand over to Letty to maybe summarize feedback from the audience.
Great. Thank you very much, Jörg, for your very interesting presentation. We have one audience member from Ireland who said that the consortia-led model there allows for apprenticeships to be awarded at EQF levels 4 to 8, which is their input. We also have lots of audience members that are introducing themselves from Portugal, Belgium. Is there anything you'd like to say on your national systems that you'd like to mention to the audience? Please feel free to message in the chat. Well, thank you very much for your introductions and your inputs. If we have missed any higher apprenticeships in Europe that from your countries, or for instance from Malta, as Jörg was mentioning in his last slide, then please feel free to add these into the comments section.
And of course, we are also open for examples from outside Europe. As I could see, we have also listeners from all over the world.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. We have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so please feel free to stay until then. But if you have any inputs that you'd like to relate to us, please include these in the chat and we will make sure to discuss these during the Q&A session. I leave the floor to you, Jörg, again for the continuation of your presentation then. Thanks all.
Yes, okay, so as Letty said, we have another opportunity at the end of our presentation to post to us any examples of higher apprenticeships in your country. But as there is time, I briefly would like to give an example about or tell you more about the German dual studies. So these dual study programs in Germany, as I said before, have been offered for quite some time by vocational academies and universities of applied sciences, and in very different formats. So in some, the focus is more on on-the-job training with sort of accompanying part-time studies. In others, it's the other way around. So students spend more time at the university and less in the company. Now, the number of dual study courses increased from around 500 in the year 2004 to over 1,600 in the year 2019. The number of participants in the same time rose from around 41,000 to around 108,000 in the same period. So, but despite this expansion, I have to mention that dual study courses are still somehow marginal compared to the overall number of students in Germany. What you can see from these numbers, if you divide them, you can see that the programs are usually small and quite specialized. So, yeah, and although these programs are called dual studies, you should know that the majority is actually not directly connected to the dual system of apprenticeship. It is simply that during the expansion of the tertiary sector, higher education providers have copied the successful model of apprenticeship and adapted it to their needs. However, having said this, there are also examples of programs which combine really a bachelor degree with a dual apprenticeship degree. You can see that on the next slide, where I took the example of the Berufliche Hochschule Hamburg. And the concept they are offering is called the Study Integrating Apprenticeship, or Studien- or Ausbildungsintegriertes Lehre. In that model, the dual VET system and higher education system are really brought together. So the learning not only takes place at the higher education institute and the company, as in many of the other dual study programs, but also at the VET school. And the learners, they acquire both a VET qualification, so one qualification out of the 250 apprenticeship occupations existing in Germany, and a bachelor or a master degree within 4 years of study. There are also opt-out options. So after 1.5 years, if a student decides only to go for the one or the other option, so either for the VET qualification or the bachelor, this is also possible. And yeah, have a look at this example of the Berufliche Hochschule Hamburg. If you like, I could have taken other examples as well. I've taken this one because they have only recently opened up and they currently offer 5 such programs. Yeah, this very short example of Germany, and I think we will now have many more examples of France, and I would like to hand over to Stephanie to go into depth on the French approach to higher apprenticeship. Sorry, my last slide, I wanted to mention the various sources I have used for that presentation. There's the one study which has been mentioned by Tim already, by the OECD, which came out only last week. And there is another brand new publication, a book published by colleagues of mine on higher vocational education and training, which is also hot out of the press, so published, I think, last week, so 2 weeks ago. Yeah, with that, I hand over to Stephanie. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So I talk directly, Laetitia? Okay, so I talk directly. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And I'm very glad to see you today. I am working in the French Ministry of Higher Education and Research, as you have seen. I am deputy head of the department in charge of the link between education and employment and employability. That's important to say that, because in France, 3 ministries are working about apprenticeship, education one, labor one, and my ministry. I also work about internships, gap year, entrepreneurship, certification, skills, and of course, apprenticeships. It's also important because you can see there that sometimes internships and apprenticeships can have a lot of link. Thank you very much, and don't hesitate to ask questions after my presentation. So I will see 3 points: the definition of the types of apprenticeships, the French model, the history and the development of higher apprenticeship in France, current and challenges level, and trend. I have tried to use something which is very interesting, I think. It's the tools that the CEDEFOP has created. So you can see here some capture of screen of those websites. So I think it's very important. So in France, apprenticeship are strongly linked to l'Equal framework. It's special in France because we are a centralized state. So the rules are national. Each region cannot therefore create its own rules. So that's very important to see that. Some different rules are existing in terms of founding sometimes. For example, in the case of the international mobility, the skills operator, it's a public establishment, who finance part of the contracts, can provide fundings that can vary. Some pay for trips, others are also compensate for a missed wage. And the region have lost their autonomy on apprenticeship. They were dealing with that before September 2018. So it's important to know. It's national. Then about the definition and the types of apprenticeship. Please, the next slide. Thank you. In France, an apprentice is defined as a young professional who follows a training course that draws on an alternation of work-based in-company training and school-based training. The concept of apprenticeship is defined by law in the remit of the apprenticeship contract, contrat d'apprentissage, and the professionalization contract, contrat de professionnalisation. which are the two main apprentice schemes in France. So an apprentice can be a young, from 15 years old, so not in the higher education, of course, they are all almost the time 18 years old or more, and also a career changer or an adult. So it's very interesting because the contrat d'apprentissage, we will see that later, as something very strong for the age, but not the contrat de professionnalisation. The minimum age to take part in an apprenticeship, as I was saying, is 16 years. Sometimes it can also be 15 years, and sometimes in France, the people have the baccalaureate very soon. So it's very interesting to do that. And the maximum is, as a principle, 29 years. So it's interesting because it was made further a few years ago. In some case, that can be later for someone who can sign a new contract to achieve a higher degree, or in other case. There's no age limit in certain case when is recognized as a worker with a disability. It's very interesting because apprenticeships is a very, very good way to make disability people included in the society by apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship plans to create or resume within a company that requires a degree, for example, individualized ADVs, ACRI, etc. There are two other possibilities to not have the age limit when the apprentice has not obtained his diploma, and when is a person registered as a high-level athlete. And it's very important in France to work with the athletes and to make them sure to make their sport as long as they can. The professionalization contract is different. It alternates period in the companies and in academic institution, of course, but it can be used later. The contrat de professionnalisation is a contract of employment alternating the principal rules for the Association of Education in a continuing education organization and periods of practice within one or more companies, which is very interesting. In France, we have a very strict base about the qualification that can be obtained with the contrat de professionnalisation or the apprenticeship contract that have to be in the repertory, which is named RNCP, qualification of a National Professional Certification Register. So it's very important because it aims to have something very strict and serious, if I can say that. Employers and operators may they find themselves in agreement with the employee the skills to be acquired under the contract. It's very interesting, those types of contract. And what is very interesting also with the contract of professionalization is that it can be used by people who have a lot of problem to be employed. It can help them to have contract, of course, in higher education, I am talking about that, but from the baccalaureate. So it can begin from the only 1 year after the baccalaureate. It's very interesting. Well, the next slide, please. The main laws regarding apprenticeships are in the French labor codes. I will not say to you all the logistical aspect of that, of course, but you have to know that it's very specific contract in France, and also very practical. The they cannot be a local work-linked contract at the level of a town or a region. The contract of a national model. A training organization can only make a work-linked training contract if its training is registered, as I was saying, in the National Directory of Professional Certification. If it's not the case, they will not be entitled to public funding for apprenticeships. And I will speak about the public funding. We have a lot of helps and funding in France. You can see on the slide the reference, the legal reference, but I will not speak further about that. The level of apprenticeship in France. It's very interesting too. The next slide, please. As you can see here, the contract can be done from 16 to 19 at all levels of studies, except for doctoral studies at this moment, and in all sectors of activity. I will speak later about doctoral studies. This is how contract in humanities and social science courses are developing, whereas this was unimaginable some time ago. And it's very interesting, this type of consequences of the development of the apprenticeship in France. We have now apprenticeships, for example, in art, in history, whatever, and human science. And it's very, very interesting to have that, because it's natural to have contract when you in apprenticeship when you are working on a material basis, but when it's more intellectual, it was not in the French approach. And for example, we have more and more apprenticeship in law too. The next slide, please. In France, apprenticeship has long been reserved for pupils, not students. The best known and most prestigious apprenticeship in France is the apprenticeship from the Compagnons du Devoir. Maybe you know that. They have existed since the 14th century. So it was very interesting to know that, because work-linked training contracts have long had a bad reputation in France, because it was only made by the people who made manual jobs, and I don't know why, but it had a bad reputation. And what is very interesting, we will see that more, is that the search for meaning and the difficulties of young people in finding their place in society has given a real revival to perform this form of study. Work-linked training students have long periods in company with a work contract. This gives them real work experience. Almost all of the work study students find a job after that contract. So it's a fact, and it's very interesting. And during the pandemic, we have seen that all the apprentices have kept their contract in France, almost all, of course. Number of apprentices, please, next. So it's urged in France. Perhaps you have heard about it, but it's incredible in our country. In the last year, we have had an incredibly increasing of the number of apprenticeship in higher education. As you can see, almost 500,000 of apprentices in France are from higher education. It represents almost 50% of the apprentices in France. It's 42 to be exact. And it's incredible. We couldn't think about that a few years ago. The number of apprenticeships has almost tripled since 2005. It's very, very impressive in France. The next slide, please. apprentices are not dropping out more compared to students or other academic courses. As you can see, with the big increase of the apprenticeship in France, there are the same number of apprentices of the secondary school, but there was an explosion, if I can say that, a big increase of the number of higher education apprentices. Social diversity, it's a very good point for the apprenticeship in higher education in France. Next slide, please. Very, very important. The social background of students is more diverse in apprenticeship programs than in the traditional routes. Perhaps you know that in France, studies are free. It's only 200 euros for every year, but even with that, a lot of young people from social bad level, as I can say, can't do their studies. And apprenticeship is a real good way to do that. There are twice as many students with a parent in the blue collar category in the first route as in the second. The proportion of young people with a parent who is an employee is 40% higher, while the proportion of students with a parent from the managerial and higher intellectual category is even lower. It's amazing, I think, and it's very interesting because we have seen that they are succeeding in their diploma as well as the other students. So it's very interesting to see that. There is in French we say the plafond de verre. It's sometimes we can see with that some poor people think they cannot succeed, and when they are using apprenticeships, they are succeeding. It's magic. Some words about doctorates. We have not exactly an apprenticeship contract about doctorates, but they can use the CIFRE. It's a specific contract for doctorates, which is using different types of work, one part in the company and one other part in the laboratory or the university. It can be very, very interesting, and it's very used by the PhD, the doctorates. Sorry. So what are the current challenges and trends in France? I hope that I'm in time. Sorry, I tried to speak. So the first thing is here I have put an interview of a French director in February who was saying that there is a very big challenge about preparing the future of our young people. And the pandemic has increased the need to include work experience in the curriculum. Internships and apprenticeships have often helped young people who do them to stay in school during the pandemic. It's a fact. And all people have seen that. And so Gilles Gatteau, that you are seeing here, is the general director of the APEC. It's the National Association for the Employment of the higher employment, upper higher education employment. Thank you. I have to say that there is a financial debate in France about apprenticeship because there are a lot of helps from the state. So how is it working in France? Companies, the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Companies subject to income tax or corporation tax whose registered office is located in France and who employ at least one person, they are liable for an apprenticeship tax. This tax is paid to the social security. So the companies it's compulsory for the companies to pay that. So it's interesting to know. But so there is this tax, and the state helps also the companies. So the principle is one young, one company, one apprenticeship training center, one labor contract, and one training contract. All this is financed by a level of care. We called it niveau de prise en charge in French for the French people here. The level of coverage or care is set by professional branch. For example, when an apprentice is studying in an engineering school, the contract will be paid by the tax until 12,000 euros for every year. For example, it's an example, okay? And when it's a master degree apprenticeship, it will be paid, for example, with 8,000 euro for every year, and it's already paid by the state. Okay. Next slide, please. Hiring aid for an apprenticeship contract. So during the pandemic, the president has decided to help more and more the companies, and it was urged because it was from 5,000 to 8,000 euros for every year of apprenticeship. So you can understand well why we have a lot of apprenticeship, of course, but it's not the only reason, because we see that it's a very deep movement that we have in France. So this help is still going on this year, but it will stop this year. Next slide, please. What we can say is that apprenticeships are suffering as a result of weakness and inadequacy in the student guidance system. Effort must be made to improve discovery and learning about the professional world at school, and thus the visibility of the professional sector. Reforms of diplomas and qualification is another unfinished task in France. There must be further focus on international mobility too. It's a very important point for us in France, because we have a problem in the legal aspect of our rules. In a global point of view for the French aspect, we can see that we have a lot of succeed with apprenticeship, and that internship can also be a very good way to have the link between companies and studies. So, as we can say in France, we have no oil, but idea. So thank you. I think it's okay for me.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephanie. And thank you also, Jörg, and to all our speakers for their contributions. Now let's move on to the Q&A session and pick up some questions that you have posted in the chat during this webinar. So I'd like to thank you all very much for your contributions. To start off, Lisa from Italy, thanks Jörg for your interesting contribution, and would like to note that on higher apprenticeships, not research apprenticeships in Italy, they were first introduced in 2003. So that's something that she wanted to know. And she also asks a question. So research apprenticeships in Italy may not necessarily include a training component at a training institution. Can we therefore consider it an apprenticeship? Jörg, would you like to chip in on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think Lisa and we had long discussions on definitions of apprenticeship before that. And well, it's considered an apprenticeship in the national context, I understand. And therefore, I would think we have to respect that also in the international comparison. If we are very strict with the international definition, of course, we wouldn't consider such an exceptional case an apprenticeship. But I also wonder how often that happens in practice. So meaning that it's not necessarily a component doesn't mean that it's not actually a component. So I don't know the real practice in Italy in this respect. That's my issue. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And she also asks whether Germans consider the dual studies scheme an apprenticeship.
Yes, I think I can answer that clearly, hopefully. The dual study programs in general, as explained, they're very different formats. And in general, they would not be considered apprenticeship because apprenticeship is only used, so to say, in the narrow sense for the dual system. But of course, there are also some, and I gave one example, some dual study programs, which in addition to the academic degree also offer the apprenticeship qualification, so a VET qualification. And that part would then be considered apprenticeship. So when you get statistics, of course, then only those qualifications are part of the statistics, and all the other programs which are merely higher education programs, they would fall under the higher education statistics and not under the statistics of the dual system. So in this sense, they are not considered in the national context as apprenticeships. But in an international context, and the way we compare it here to the UK and to France, I think it's okay to call them a high apprenticeship. So we have to distinguish here national definitions and international context. And it would be actually quite interesting to compare then the figures, because as we've heard from Stephanie, we have 40% of all apprentices, more or less, so to say, in higher education. We know from the UK, 1/3 of all apprentice starts are now at higher levels. And if you, of course, would count those dual study programs in Germany as part of the statistics, you would not get that figure yet, but of course, a more similar figure, rather than saying there are no high apprenticeships at all, or just that minority fraction, so to say, I was referring to, for those which really combine the two sorts of qualifications. But Tim is from Germany as well. He might share his view on that specific question as well.
It's a difficult question. In Germany, in any case, the definition of higher VET is a bit narrower. So many programs that in Germany are not considered higher VET would be considered higher VET in other countries. But it's true that these dual study programs, I mean, they're called dual study programs in Germany. They're not called dual apprenticeships or higher apprenticeships. But I mean, that's a bit the thing with the definitions. If you compare different national definitions, which are very different, then you have EU level definitions. So for us to get a very comprehensive view, I think it's important to not always to stick very, very narrowly to the national definitions, but to look a bit at, even though things are called differently from country to country, but to have a common understanding to really broaden a bit the scope.
Great. Thank you very much, both. And thank you, Lisa, for your questions. Moving on to Lito from Greece, who asks whether all seminars and vocational training centers in Greece are considered apprenticeships. Would any of you know how to answer this question? Okay, thank you. Julia from Italy mentions that for high-level apprenticeship programs, it is expected that part of the university exams are carried out within the company, which is an interesting note. Thank you. And this requires a heavy commitment in terms of designing a city course. So for instance, a master's degree. She wonders whether this is the same in other countries as well.
Well, the high commitment in terms of designing programs for higher education, I think that's true probably for all the countries, definitely, because it's much more challenging to make sure that this duality between company and higher education is guaranteed. So in any way, it requires a higher commitment in the design of programs. On the specific question whether, so to say, exams also have to take place at the company, I don't think there is a particular rule in the countries I know and I have studied, although there is such a diversity of programs actually that I can't also exclude it that we will find some examples, but it's not an obligation as such to organize it that way. Yeah.
Great, thank you for your input, Jörg. Two more questions and then we'll move on to the conclusions. So in Greece, the implementation of training programs for professionals and employees in all product sectors, as well as lifelong learning programs, hold a particularly important position. Would you agree that this seems to be the case in other national realities as well across Europe?
If I may, in France, it's a real question about higher education diplomation for the employees, the professional, the adults, as we can say in France. We have a big problem about that, and I have to say that it's very interesting because we have been contacted by India because they have the same problem. They have a big problem about training their adults, their workers. And in France, we are working a lot with technical qualification, which are called titre professionnel, professional title. And a lot of adults don't work to obtain master degree or engineer diploma, etc. It's not good in France at this moment, but it's very important and it's a priority. Yeah, and we have seen that during the pandemic there was a lot of requests about that.
I can compliment from the European level that actually participation in lifelong learning is a big challenge and a topic that we have very high on the agenda. We see, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, that participation in lifelong learning is still far too low given the challenges and the changes on the labor market. So what we did is that we set a target that by 2030 in the EU, 60% of adults should have participated in a training over the last 12 months. And just to give you an idea, the last figures we have available are around 36, 37%. So there's really a big gap between this target and where we stand today. And an even bigger problem is that very often, if you look at the groups who actually participate, then it's mostly the highly skilled who participate most often, who would probably need it less than those low skilled who are at risk of automation, of losing their jobs, who participate the least. So there we really need to create incentives, and at EU level, we have now two proposals for what we call council recommendations, one on individual learning accounts, another one on micro-credentials, which both aim to focus more on the individual, to really empower the individual worker to participate in learning, to grasp the opportunities that are there. But really there we need a cultural change to develop what we usually call a culture of lifelong learning, which is unfortunately not always and not very present at the moment.
Thank you very much both for your inputs. And just to let the audience know that we will also be sharing the slides and the recording of this session following today's webinar as well. So if there are any technical questions on what the experts have specified within the slides, these should be shared following this meeting. So thank you very much for your inputs. I would like to now leave the floor to Tim for his conclusion and as well his thoughts on challenges and trends. Thank you all.
Sorry, just to give an answer to Patricia. So it was almost 3 600,000 apprenticeship in higher education in France, and it's almost 42% of all apprentices in France. Sorry, but just to give the answer.
Thank you very much. I missed that question. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stephanie and Jörg, for both your presentations. It was very interesting to learn, to get a more broader overview of different country practices and then to zoom into the French example. I think what we all could see is that there is a huge diversity of national approaches, that even the definitions vary a lot from country to country, but that at the same time there is a trend across Europe towards this kind of programs, however you call them, however you define them in more detail. Now, if you, can you see the slide? Well, if we go back to the presentation, because we have one more slide. If you go to the next slide, please. To finish with a few challenges and trends for higher apprenticeships, even though we have already discussed a few of them in the Q&A. So what we can see more generally is that, of course, because of this dichotomy between theory and practice, academic and vocational context, this is on the one hand the big benefit of this kind of higher vet, higher apprenticeship programs, but at the same time, it's of course a challenge to find the right balance, and depends also, of course, a lot on the occupational field, on the program. We see that flexibility of provision is very good, of course. It allows tailor-made programs, but at the same time, developing tailor-made programs, we talked before about the involvement of employers, is also very resource intensive, requires a lot of input, and can also be a challenge in a way. The same goes for quality assurance mechanism, because of the fact that the classes are not only offered in classrooms, at universities, at higher education institutions, but also in companies when it comes to higher apprenticeships. So this, of course, poses also an additional challenge when it comes to quality assurance. And last but not least, awareness and visibility are key and are a key challenge when it comes to higher vet more generally, when it comes to vocational education and training more generally. Because unfortunately, and Stephanie, I think, explained it very well with the French example, that apprenticeships traditionally and vocational education and training traditionally has often been seen as the less reputational career path compared to higher education, which is, of course, a pity, and which we try very much to change, to show that this kind of career path is a very attractive choice. When we look at the occupational profiles that are needed now, for example, for the green transition, we see that the vast majority of skilled workforce needed for the transition are actually medium skilled people, so those that usually have completed vocational education and training. So we need this kind of professionals, and we need to attract more young people to follow a vet path, but also more workers when they think about reskilling to also consider this kind of pathway. But, and these are my last words, I think that higher apprenticeships and this kind of innovative models that bring together the vet world and the higher education world can also help to increase the attractiveness of vet and show its potential as a very potentially successful career path beyond the traditional vet learners. Thank you very much, and give the mic back to Letty.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your conclusion. And yes, thank you all for listening today. This brings us to the end of our webinar. Do also keep an eye out on the Apprenticeship Support Services website for news and further information about the upcoming webinars. We're very excited to announce that the EAfA, in close collaboration with the DG for Mobility and Transport, and the Austrian Federal Railways Organization and the Federal Ministry for Climate Protection, Environment, Energy and Mobility are organizing a high-level event on the 9th and 10th of June in Vienna, and registrations are open until the 20th of May, so there's still plenty of time to register. Also, we'd like to mention and invite you on behalf of the European Commission to the EYE Global Info Day in Poland. This is a virtual event which will take place on the 19th of May. Registrations will close on the 18th of May. And then finally, we'd also like to remind you of the EAfA Awards. So the awards recognize outstanding contributions made by organizations and apprentices, and 2 candidates from the 3 awards categories have been shortlisted as nominees. So winners will be announced on the 18th of May at an award ceremony as part of the European Vocational Skills Week. Please visit the EAfA website or LinkedIn as well. I would like to say a big thank you to all of our speakers for being with us today, and to everybody who joined us and your active participation. It was really interesting to hear your questions and your thoughts. So as I mentioned earlier, the recording and the presentation will be shared with you in the upcoming days. And yeah, thank you again for your participation, and I hope to see you in future webinars. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Bye.
All the
Thank you.
best.